I'd like to call the meeting of the Planning Commission, February 4th, 2025, to order at 7 p.m. Would the clerk please take the roll?
Happily. Commissioner LaSalle,
Here.
Commissioner Olson,
Here.
Commissioner Dorian,
Here.
Commissioner Macias. Here. Commissioner Vanderlyn,
Here.
Vice Chair Thompson,
Here.
Chair Bonashinsky,
Here.
all present.
All right, thank you. Next, we have our land acknowledgement.
We acknowledge that the city of Kenmore is situated upon the ancestral lands of the Snohomish, Snoqualmie, Sauk-Suiattle, Duwamish, Stillaguamish, Tulalip, Suquamish, Muckleshoot, and other tribes who are part of the Coast Salish peoples. We recognize and express our deepest respect for their enduring stewardship and profound relationship with this land, which they have cherished and protected since times immemorial. We honor the First Peoples, acknowledge their vibrant cultures, and commit ourselves to learning from their wisdom in our journey to promote justice, equity, and mutual understanding. We pledge to stand alongside these communities in acknowledging past injustices and working towards a future that respects and celebrates the diverse heritage of this land.
Okay, please join me in standing for the Pledge of Allegiance. Great. Next on our agenda, we have public comment. We welcome our community members to the Planning Commission meeting. In this forum, the Commission does not engage or dialogue with the public. Our primary role is to listen. We will hear from our on-site guests first, followed by our pre-registered virtual guests. All guests must address comments to the Commission. The clerk will acknowledge your request and call your name when it is your turn. Your time will start when we confirm that we can hear you. Please state your name and city of residence for the record and keep your comments to 3 minutes. We will not split your time with others or reset your time except by express approval of the chair. You can submit materials to the clerk in advance. This meeting is being recorded. Thank you for taking the time to share your comments. Clerk, is there anyone signed up for public comment?
Thank you, Chair. We have one individual signed up for on-site public comment, and that's going to be Elizabeth Mooney.
Madam Chair, a point of information is Commissioner Dorian virtual?
Yes, he roll called and said he was present
Oh, I
virtually.
didn't hear him. Okay, thank you very much. I'm sorry.
Go. Hi, Elizabeth Mooney, City of Kenmore. I want to first just thank all of you for being planning commissioners. Thanks to Tracy Bonazinski being a friend and now the chair. I had decided that I should learn more about Planning Commission. And she gave a lovely description at our PERC meeting. And so I just want to thank you for doing that. Good news, in February 26th, PERC is having a meeting. It's going to be in the community hall behind us. And the great news is that the city staffer, Mr. Sylvia, and WSDOT are going to be giving a presentation about the culvert that's going to be made fish passable under 522. So hopefully you'll spread that word, and really appreciate that our nonprofit, People for Environmentally Responsible Kenmore, is having success at working with the city and WSDOT in getting the word out about salmon restoration in our community. Secondly, I really tried hard last week to take off the docket Bastyr. And I had just heard about Bastyr wanting to, I guess, sell some of their land, and have you all considered changing the code? And so I had hoped it'd just take it off the docket, but you have it. And I understand the 4 votes to keep it on your docket, because I think that made also sense. But now you've got more work, because you're going to have to listen to people like me coming in and saying, I completely oppose Bastyr asking our city, and if it's true, our state legislature, to support them selling property. I heard that, again, this is through the grapevine, but I'm trying to spread the word because they are basically in a habitat that PERC was invited to help learn about way back when they had a community advisory group. And our former council member Brent Smith and I were both on it. I know it's a great facility. I've taken doula classes up there, but they are the stewards of that property, and it should be, in my opinion, protected as it is. There's already a ball field. That's great. But if anything, it should remain an educational facilities land, in my opinion. And I think as people start learning what they're up to, maybe, we should talk well, the UW has EERC up there. Thank you.
Chair, that concludes public comment.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for coming and sharing your thoughts. All right, that brings us to our consent agenda. Under the consent agenda is approval of previous meeting minutes. I will entertain a motion to approve the consent agenda.
So moved.
I will second that. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Point of information, Madam Chair.
Yes.
Just to clarify, as I understand it, the issue of the comments, that issue is not before the commission at all, as it has not been formally placed onto our agenda because of lack of application at this time.
All right, thank you. Any opposed to approval of the consent agenda? Then approval of the consent agenda is passed unanimously. We will next move on to middle housing regulations, a discussion that we are continuing on our January 27th joint meeting with the City Council. Todd and Debbie, do you have anything you'd like to lead with?
Good evening. This evening, we just wanted to give the Planning Commission an opportunity to have an open dialogue discussion. There's no formal presentation this evening, but we just wanted to give everyone the opportunity to kind of debrief, have a debrief or circle back after last week's joint meeting. So it's really the floor is yours. We're here to hopefully answer any questions that you might have, and just know that the consultants are busily working on the draft codes as we speak, and they'll be presenting at the next meeting on February 18th. But we at least wanted to not cancel the meeting, but have an open discussion with you all. So that's really all I have to say, unless Debbie has anything else to add.
No, I don't. So it's just, it is that after the meeting last week, if you sort of any additional questions, any additional follow-up comments, that we can then let our consultants know to incorporate in the draft.
I'll kick it off, just out of the blue question. ADUs, could you educate us a little bit on how they are taxed? They involved in property taxes? How is that valued and levied, or other taxes?
I don't know. I do not know how ADUs are taxed. I can try and find out.
Thank you. So I know they are exempt from development tax, so it'd be nice to know how the city recoups its costs going forward.
I always missed them.
Yes, Commissioner Dorian, go ahead.
Thank you. My question is about the direction that council gave last week. I believe they were asked, I think it was 6 questions, and it would help if we can just recap I know it wasn't necessarily a formal vote on those, but kind of the direction. Well, actually, some of them did have a formal vote, but what the direction was from council for those questions that they were asked, just to recap, would be helpful if possible.
I'm looking for the email. Hold on. Here's what I have. In terms of types of units, 6 of the 9, there was interest in excluding 5 to 6 plexes. On the density question, excluding R1 for purposes of creating habitat, wildlife corridors, etc. And R4 lots adjacent to the Sammamish River for the same reason. Inclusionary housing, fee in lieu, no, there was a concern about increased cost, disincentive for development. But on inclusion, I can make a comment to that. If we are going with the tier 2 approach, then for within a quarter mile of transit, you have to allow 4 units, including 1 affordable unit. So there will have to be some discussion around that in terms of affordable housing. And we've also asked Arch to provide some background information based on their experience in other jurisdictions who have adopted it. So at least then, when we're having the discussion about affordable housing around transit stops to be in compliance with that tier 2, we'll at least have information for you. So that was that. And then to regulate by density, it was bulk rather than density. And for impact fees, it was status quo on exemption for ADUs. Those were my notes from the joint meeting.
Thank you.
Would you like to hear our thoughts, just kind of generally to anticipate what we're thinking about? Okay.
Yep.
Commissioner Olson, did you?
Yeah, I just wanted to say what I am aware of as far as ADU taxes is, my understanding is it's typically considered an improvement to the property, and then that would be taxed on the total unit. I don't know how that works if you condoize it though. And I'm not sure if there's other potential tax implications beyond that. That's my impression or my understanding of it. So it's more indirectly taxed oftentimes if it's maintained as part of the single family house as opposed to condoized.
Yeah, I just actually, as you spoke, I looked it up, and I just said, how are ADUs taxed in Washington State? It says they're exempt from property taxes for a period of time after construction, depending on the jurisdiction, and then the value is then added to the primary residence. So.
Sorry to jump in as a follow-up question to that. Could you look up how that works if it's condoized? Just, sorry.
There's an answer to that. But yeah, carry on.
Okay, Commissioner Vanderlyn?
Thank you. That was pretty much what I anticipated was going to be the answer. My concern here, or question about this, is if the value is eventually added to was the primary residence, and ADUs are actually now envisioned as something quite different from they were in the past, and they could be separate unit lot locations with separate ownership, essentially either under a condo rule or as a separate residence in itself, they are then tax-free. And the primary residence, whoever owns that in perpetuity, has the responsibility for property tax.
Taxing is out of my, it's
I
really not
understand it,
in
but-
any
That
way
is
sense of
something that
form,
I
part
would
of
be
my
curious to
wheelhouse here. So we're
understand.
going to have to do some checking to see whether if an ADU is put on a separate lot, how does that work in terms of taxing structure? And I don't know the answer to that.
Again, I'm not surprised, but I think it's an issue we need to think about. Because what you have there would be a single first of all, it could be a really important impediment for development. If you're going to be constantly increasing the value for tax purposes of that primary residence, whereas the ADU essentially becomes tax-free, there's some adverse incentives and there are unintended consequences that come out of that. So I don't know if anybody has worked that through in their thinking, but it seems to be a hole that I just worry over.
Actually, as a follow-up to that, I think I am wondering rather if there is a designation of purpose for ADUs that we need to consider. If ADUs are going to be, as the name intends, kind of an annex to the primary property, then they would not have the same obligations. But if we are seeing ADUs as mini primary properties, then in terms of access, in terms of independence, et cetera, I'm wondering if there is a consideration to bring for those to make sure that they have closer to the regulations that we have for a regular property on that lot, so that they are not just an annex to the primary property, but a mini primary property.
I think you've put your finger on the issue here, which is at some point, does an ADU no longer an ADU? It's
Exactly.
something else. It's transitioned into a missing middle housing classification. And at which point then it would have the same responsibility for public tax support as any other would. If it's truly a traditional ADU where it truly is ancillary, then it's not separately, it shouldn't be separately treated. It shouldn't be available as a separate sale. It shouldn't be condoized. It's something different. But I think that definition of ADU needs to be revised for a more modern, up-to-date standard.
Yes, but I think that, I think that while it is probably not realistic to consider ADUs to be second real primary properties, we probably want to have a clear cut of this is how much of it is an ADU, and therefore just make a call on in terms of access, in terms of utilities, how independent are ADUs or how non-independent are ADUs, so that we don't kind of make ADUs shoehorned into just increasing densification of primary properties by calling them ADUs when in fact they're not ADUs, they are mini primary properties.
Commissioner Olson?
I think you are both bringing up great points. I think one thing that I was discussing with, I think her name is Catherine, she sent an email and she develops ADUs, and she had actually some similar concerns and requests as far as working with NUD, for instance, to try and have subletted utility meters so that you can split off the utility meters and separate units, things like that. In those instances, you become much more of your own entity, right, where it's condoized. And I guess this is kind of a question for staff that I was asked by a planner like, 4 years ago. And the question was, what is the difference between a tiny house and a detached accessory dwelling unit? And as far as I could tell, it was entirely technical and in our description of it, not really fundamentally based off of the physical characteristics of a detached accessory dwelling unit in a tiny house of the same size. Do you have any additional thoughts on that I might be missing?
Well, I think as you heard in the conversation with council, definitions are tricky. If you're looking at it, what point does a duplex become a row house, or is it a tiny house? Is it a single family residence? So having a definition and figuring that out is part of the issue that we will be wrestling with. So I don't have an answer right now.
Well, I can say that when the tiny house, I'd say movement kind of came about, was that tiny houses were really it's a prefabricated type of a unit, right? So an ADU is more of a stick-built, like traditional, framed building. And a tiny house would be something like a builder would do, like a manufactured type of a home, but much, much smaller, say under 500 square feet or something like that. So you're thinking like between a shed and a I guess an ADU type size. So there was a market for that in that kind of middle ground, 500 square feet or less. Whereas an ADU is more of a traditional built structure that is obviously under 1,000 square feet, but is subordinate to the primary house. And then I've seen like tiny home villages where you've got a property that might be owned by a city or a nonprofit, and then you've just got a whole bunch of them. I know that this was pretty common in Portland recently. I've seen a number of those down there. And so that's kind of the sort of differences between a tiny home and a ADU. But that's all I can really offer right now.
Commissioner Olson.
Thank you. I think that kind of got to, I think you went a little deeper actually than I was even considering. When I was thinking a tiny house, I was more thinking, I guess, a really small house,
Yeah.
more in line with an ADU, but I think you alluded to that. I suppose my perspective on it is once it's condoized, it should be treated as its own residence effectively. And if in those instances, it would have its own taxes and ideally its own utility meters and information so that those things are separated and distinct and on the owner, right? To me, the taxes should be going to whoever owns the property, right? And so if it's a single family house with an ancillary accessory dwelling unit, the property owner owns that ADU. And if you condoize it out, then I would imagine, and this is, I think, to his point, something we need to confirm, that it should be taxed that way.
I mean, it's important. It's great information and good dialogue. It's just important to note that the city of Kenmore doesn't have any really control other than like if there was a collective of cities or, a city lobbyist to kind of go and discuss that with the state legislature to, have, if we had concerns on that as a region or, that kind of a thing. Because King County, all the counties are the ones that do the assessments. So it's not the city of Kenmore doing the assessments other than the portion of tax that goes, for city purposes. But King County assessments, Snohomish County, Pierce County, so on and so forth, they're the ones that do the assessment. And one thing I wanted to just to circle back on the stuff that we were talking about a little bit earlier. So I did find in the ADU guidance book of Washington State, so this would be from Commerce, the guidebook. Some of you may have seen this. So it does say that there's an RCW that authorizes counties to provide a 3-year property tax exemption for improvements to a single family dwelling, including the construction of an ADU, as long as it's 30% less of the value of the original structure. And then there's, goes on to say ADU owners may deduct for income tax purposes construction costs over time, annual property taxes, and shared monthly utility costs from rental proceeds, which may help encourage their development. So just wanted to note that. So that's in the guidance book that you can find if you just type Commerce ADU guidebook.
Commissioner LaSalle.
Thanks. I think you made a great point of definitions are tricky. And I know that in the last conversation last week, there was a fair amount of discussion on 4plexes versus 5plexes versus 3plexes, et cetera. And since definitions are so hard to understand, what is a 3plex versus a 4plex plus versus those kind of nuances, it feels as though it would be beneficiary to have more of visioning from a guidance perspective of what we hope generally Kenmore could look like in the future with those new rules, rather than over focusing on townhouses versus ADUs versus all of those. And so I'm just wondering, in terms of calendar, is there an expectation to have further kind of visioning related guidance, or not necessarily at this stage?
If you can expand a little more on what you mean by a visioning process, because I'm not
Sure.
really
So
sure.
if we don't, I mean, it's going to be very hard to agree on definitions, because if you change a tiny house into an ADU, agreeing on one versus the other might make for very interesting but very long conversations. But if and so because of that, I don't know how necessarily beneficial it would be to have early on clear decisions one way or the other of yes to ADUs, no to tiny homes, or those kind of things. But on the other hand, I'm imagining that if we had more guidance on, or more directionality on, this is how we're hoping Kenmore downtown versus on the hills versus on next to, for example, I know that there were some conversations around Swamp Creek or around protected areas would be, that could help us guide maybe more recommendations, go into the details of, if this is the kind of focus we want to have of protecting tree canopies or protecting protected areas, then we could figure out more of the nitty gritty of, okay, well, what does it mean in terms of lot management? I don't know if hopefully that makes sense.
It does, but it's still going to come down to things have to be written down in the code. And so we can have that bigger discussion in terms of, are there areas that should be limited to a certain type of unit or a certain size of unit or something like that. But I think overall, the direction for middle housing is it needs to be compatible with a single family neighborhood, whether in terms of scale, size, and so forth. So that's what we're trying to juggle with these regulations, is to create something which people understand what it is that they can build, where they can build it, and how all those regulations fit together. Because it's not just the zoning code. We then have to take a look at things like road standards and utilities and things like that. But again, I think part of that is you've sort of had kind of that discussion a little bit around areas that you want to protect more in terms of the natural environment or habitat or wildlife. So that's kind of an excluding houses from there. So if there's any further discussion in a broader sense like that, then be happy to hear it. Otherwise, we have to try and write the code to reflect what can be allowed where and what it's going to look like. And there is some guidance in terms of definitions. And of course, we'll be looking at other jurisdictions because we're not the only ones struggling with this. So yes, so if you have any thoughts on along those lines, then let's hear them.
Commissioner Macias?
Kind of to go back and then I'll come back to that. There was a lot of discussion around stacked flats as an option, and I kind of had a follow-up question on that. Do we, or can we, or do we now have code that would allow stacked flats in single-family existing homes, or is this just new construction, or is there a way to define that to older homes with, we've all been on Capitol Hill and Beacon Hill. I lived in a home that was 3 units in one home. Does that qualify as a stacked flat?
I mean, I'm trying to think of, I know you sent me some questions on that the other day. Again, that's sort of kind of a gray area of what stacked units are. So they could be a triplex that's vertical. It could be, I mean, I know we're not, the council is not directing us to do sixplexes, but it could be a sixplex that's vertical or, so I guess the answer is it's still sort of a gray area on what that actually means, but there's some examples out there of what they could look like, which one of them, which I think I sent to you this week, was sort of this vertical, skinnier version that, and not to say that this would be something we would see here in Kenmore, but it's just a type of stack, which would be possibly, I don't know, I'm guessing on the width here, but probably, 75 feet, 100 feet, maybe a little wider, and then they go up. My understanding is that even some of them don't have an elevator, so they would just be something that they would just be accessible by stairs only, just to reduce the cost. But yeah, I mean, I've even tried searching myself on what exactly that means, and so they come in different flavors, I guess you could say. So I don't really have the best answer right now, but I think, some of the examples that we saw from our consultants that have showed before in previous conversation, that at least gives you some context to what they're going to be. But I think the short of it is going to be what can be accommodated on a particular lot, and how, if just say a developer has this much space to work with, this is what they're going to build. And so that's really, it's just the constraints of a particular lot. Now, if they own a couple lots, they might be able to spread that out. So, yeah, I guess it's just kind of a, we'll see what the market bears here in Kenmore, but we'll, also we have to determine what our codes are actually going to say, and what we would want to allow. I mean, that's kind of what we're talking about here, so.
Commissioner Vanderlyn and then Commissioner Olson.
Yes, just to return to the earlier conversation about how do you, without an overall arching vision, how do you take something like missing middle and fit it into what the city's objective would be? Having been here for a while, I can think back to discussions we had some time ago when we were looking at all of the different land use definitions within the city. And this was actually partnered with, or it's part of what eventually became the missing middle conversation. And as I recall, what we came up with at the time was that we wanted to have the high-rise, potentially affordable housing, multifamily, centered on our major transit areas, particularly 522. And we redid a lot of our transit area in downtown, anticipating and allowing that sort of building and development to happen. Where at the same time, we would look at the single family neighborhoods, and we would allow, and now we have to allow, missing middle in there. But the idea was we wouldn't be looking to increase density in those areas, maximize density in those areas. We'd be looking to accommodate different housing types, which I think was consistent with what the message we got from the city council was, that they weren't looking for missing middle to solve the healthcare slipping in there, the affordable housing costs, or to see it maximize the amount of density we could have in there, but rather to have something that's more compatible with the existing single family neighborhoods, and to concentrate our density and our affordability in multifamily along them. So I think even though that's not been actually documented anywhere, I think it's a policy that is reflected in our current zoning. And I think it's something we can live to if the Planning Commission finds commissioners find that acceptable.
Commissioner Olson.
I think all three of the last comments tie in pretty well with what I was about to talk about. So when I first learned about missing middle housing, going to the visioning side of things, the way I read about it was as a way of people making the best use of the place they live for where they're at a particular point in their life, or whatever they may need. So I could see an existing single-family house becoming a stacked flat with 3 houses in it, potentially, depending upon the layout of the house, obviously, and other considerations and features. But rather than tearing down the house, you potentially gut it and rebuild it and turn it into a stacked flat. And I could also see a stacked flat going from 3 houses to a single-family house, if that's what the person that buys that house wants and needs and makes sense for them. And we've seen this happen in the past in areas, in other cities, frankly. Maybe it's happened here and I'm unaware of it. But I think for me, that's the big benefit of missing middle. And that's what I want to see from it, is allowing people to have the flexibility and choice to live in a place that makes sense for them, or to offer the housing solutions that make sense for them and their family or friends. How we start defining all the other pieces around ownership and stuff like that, I think that's kind of where it gets tricky. But so long as it's one unit and one property, I think we should encourage people to redevelop an existing lot, and as opposed to, demoing the entire building and going in and putting townhomes potentially, because we know, frankly, that it's cheaper. Existing housing is cheaper than the new construction. In 5 to 10 years, that won't be the case, because whatever you built 5 to 10 years ago is now existing housing. But that cost gets assumed at some point. So that's just my vision of it, is allowing people to have that flexibility and choice what type of housing gets built. I don't see missing middle housing necessarily dramatically increasing density. It might increase unit density. I'll use where I live as an example. The number of people that lived in the single family home before it had effectively an ADU was 4 people. And my family, I moved in, my parents moved in, there's now 6 people. So yeah, we increased density. We added 2 people. But it's 2 units. We didn't double the density, right? We increased it 50% because they're 2 smaller units. So I don't see this solving any housing problems or crises. I see this as offering additional choice, and it might have an effect on the margins, but it's not going to be the thing that drives increased density.
Commissioner Macias?
I'm in complete agreement with that. I think we've known that from the beginning. Missing middle housing is not affordable housing. We see that from Kimley Horn, that missing middle units are in the upper 80 to 120%. So I have a strong feeling that trying to increase density in this missing middle zone is just not where it's at, especially when we have downtown and a land capacity analysis that tells us we have more capacity than we need, and it's downtown, and we are not there yet on our downtown. So that's just kind of my personal feeling, is that, we allow these, the 6 of 9 homes, we meet state regulations on what we need to do, but I'm with you. I do not think this is the magic bullet for housing density. This is not where it's at. So yeah.
Well, that's true. It isn't. Largely, this is housing choice. And the way historically single-family zoning has excluded these as housing choices. So if you look back historically, in the 50s, these kind of units were common to be mixed with single-family homes. And then zoning changed all that. So this is essentially trying to say, there needs to be more choice, and the only way to have more choice is now the state is kind of forcing the issue. But I think that there are very good reasons for having choice of kind of units to meet the needs of the community. Why not? So I think if that's, I think we're all on the same page there, and I think we're all on the same page that whatever choices we decide on need to be compatible and need to fit in. And that's where the code comes in. And yes, it's hard to write code to predict every single circumstance, but we're going into this to balance that we know there needs to be to try and, minimize footprint, to minimize impervious surface, to retain the natural environment, to retain trees, to look at ways to make it more affordable in terms of things like utilities, So again, I think we're all on the same page in terms of what middle housing is and isn't. And now we're down to the nitty gritty of trying to write the code. But when we're doing that, we are still keeping those overarching direction in mind. So, and that's what we heard when we did the community outreach in the first phase of middle housing, that that when you had a discussion, you know, people were like, yeah, it made sense. People could always relate to the need for having more housing choice based on, you know, their different circumstances in life. It made sense. So I think if again, we're all approaching it from the same way, and maybe that's sort of part, Commissioner LaSalle, to get back to the visioning, is that I think those overarching principles are going to kind of lead us to a code solution to meet that vision of, you know, preserving the environment, minimizing footprint, you know, having that balance.
Commissioner LaSalle and then Commissioner Dorian.
Yeah, thanks. I loved everything you said, and so much so that I'm hesitating of if my comment has any value beyond what you just said. It was just thinking about what had been discussed with the fact that lots of Kenmore is already built. And so probably, I'm assuming, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the challenge is going to be more in conversion than net construction. And if so, to try and be a bit more practical than my comment about visioning, I think it would be wonderful if we could have in follow-up conversations, discussions on the impact of code with regards to how can we encourage building upwards, not wider. And the reason why I say that is that on a specific lot of a specific size, the house, single-family house or whatever is built there doesn't occupy the entire area. And having the ability to preserve that space within the lot, to preserve tree canopy, to preserve green spaces, et cetera, and therefore encourage building upwards rather than just having a bigger footprint of the actual built lot would be something that at least personally would be very important to me.
Commissioner Dorian.
I think for me, what I want to make sure is that we do encourage diversity of housing types and don't just end up with something that's 10% cheaper than a new family home. So I know I've mentioned this a few times in previous discussions, but my feeling is that developers know how to build townhomes and sell them for about $1.1 million in Kenmore. Large slot home style developments that have luxury feeling items added within them to justify the price tag that is getting close. It's not quite there, but it's close to the price of a single family home. My concern is that we need to write code that means that we don't just see that as the only type of development that we have that's coming from middle housing. I think there's elements around that in terms of the parking regulations that we're looking at that within quarter mile, or it may even be half mile, I can't remember. But the difference in parking would naturally lead to a different market rate, because to Todd's point, we are going to see what the market will bear, but I think our code can encourage the market in certain directions for certain points. And I mean, obviously, we can't force what developers are going to build, but we can stop it just being a quick turn. I think that would be where the concern is, as we're opening up, that we don't accidentally open up to just land being used for one purpose. I guess the other thing that's been referenced a bit is ADUs, and I think we had given policies within the housing element that we do want to encourage the reuse of existing properties, somewhat more like remodel plus add the ADU, that kind of thing. If there are things where there's room for that kind of encouragement within the code now at this point, that would be useful. Last thought, I think I got the impression last week from the consultants that impact fees could be used at differing levels for different levels of incentive. So again, we're not creating affordable housing, but I think we want to create a diversity of housing so that we don't just end up with the middle housing types that are only affordable at 120%. So if there's something we can do with the impact fees to, again, just encourage diversity, I think that would be useful, because I'm not sure I entirely agree with the trickle down sentiment that came from council, that like if we remove impact fees, then that will be passed on to consumers. I don't know that I fully agree with that. I think we've got a townhome development that within Kenmore right now that's going to happen where the big selling point to investors is they're going to make 20% profit. I could easily see that growing to now the selling point is you're going to make 30% profit. So how do we avoid that? I think is my concern as we're thinking about code.
Vice Chair Thompson.
So 3 items. First of all, about the ADUs. So let's take a ADU that is 750 square feet in a backyard, and there is no way to put a driveway or egress other than a trail at best next to the existing home. And the obvious intent for that ADU is, like we thought in the beginning of ADUs, for an extended family, someone like that, friend of family. So what I'm concerned that, now, first question is, are those counted toward our housing today as far as independent units, housing units?
And
The ones that I described that are there's no other, really no other way to use them except with friends of the family or relatives of the family and that type of situation.
are you asking if they're counted in terms of the middle housing or just as the, how many units we have?
Of housing available. Is it counted separately or is it counted with the single family home?
I think they're considered, they're not part of the totals of the single family, I don't think. Yeah.
We can double check. I
Yeah.
don't think so.
So that was one of my questions, and I think that when we think of the regulations, and we were talking about what would make a missing middle ADU versus just a regular old ADU, I think we need to be kind of clear about that in my mind. What are the elements? And if the element is to have it's able to be sold, or is it going to be sold as a condo, or is it going to be sold as a separate house? And what are the requirements of each? From an ADU perspective, because this, we even have some ADU code that exempts ADUs from certain parts of our other codes, like I think I read that they are not responsible to comply with the tree conservation ordinance. Build one. As-
I'm
as
not
an
going to get
example.
in, I don't know, I don't have the code in terms of ADUs and exemptions, so let's just put that question aside. But I think you are asking the same question in a different way than we had from Commissioner Vanderland and Commissioner Olson in terms of how do you make that distinction when an ADU is then put on a separate lot? Does it become something else? So you're asking the same question in a different way. So I think that's part of things that we'll have to wrestle with when ADUs are separated on a different lot in terms of ownership. How is that? What happens then in terms of how they are addressed in code, or under what circumstances can you separate an ADU onto a separate lot? Would they then have to have their own driveway, their own parking, their own meters? So again, I think it's a question that we'll have to address.
And I agree with that. Which brings me to the other point that was made about 3 flats top of each other. Let's just think about that picture that we saw in the presentation. So we're not talking about town homes, or we're not, or anything like that. I'm just talking about literally a flat or 1-bedroom. 3, 1, 2, 3. There are often 3 floors. Homes are often built like that in Europe. Their square footage on each floor is pretty small, but they either have an elevator or you're walking up a lot of stairs and back down. So my concern is, so we give them breaks and we allow them to do things to build the 3 units of middle housing. The comment was that they could, the owner, whoever that is, whether, if it's condo, if someone bought up all 3 condos, or they were just renting out the 3 flats and they still own them, I'm certain that there would have been some sort of liberalization of the code to have built those 3 flats. So my concern is if we have given them a benefit, how do we make them pay for that benefit when they decide to convert back to 1? Just putting it out there.
I'm trying to track with this as a comment or a question. So you're saying if it was built as a stacked flat with 3 units and then it was converted to a single family home, is that the
In
question?
10 years, right. Exactly.
I don't know how we would track that for one. Yeah, I mean, yeah.
It's kind of the similar question you're asking about some of the others. You know, what happens if something else, you know, it starts off as one thing and ends up as something else? That's really what you're asking, whether it's a stacked flat that becomes a single family home, whether it was an accessory dwelling unit, which is then subdivided onto a separate lot. How, you know, does that change how it was originally permitted, or under what circumstances could you do that? I don't know. I think there's probably many what if scenarios we could come up with. So we can think about those, but we may not be able to come up with all the answers to the what if scenarios.
I can understand that. My primary concern is that if the owner was given a benefit to build the 3 units that they would not have had if it would have been a single family home, like an exemption to the height requirement. That could be it. I'm just, but you're right. It is a what if, but it possibly could be a pretty hot what if for those people in single family neighborhoods right now. So I'll just put it out there. My last point has to do with taxes and fees. And we've spent a lot of time on this commission discussing the cost to the city for increased density. And folks I heard at the city council meeting that we were a part of, that, well, we don't want to increase impact fees. You don't want to see, necessarily increased property taxes. But the fact is by doing that, we're subsidizing the missing middle, or the middle, let's forget the missing part. It'll be there someday. The middle housing, and these individuals, developers or lot owners, that are going to get a benefit from doing this type of development. So why should they not pay the same impact fees to do so that they get the same services that they would be entitled to for, and certainly like water and fire, they're separate districts, but we have needs in our city, such as police, parks, roads, sidewalks, all of those types of items. Bicycling trails. And I have a hard time taking this middle housing agenda and exempting it from our fee structure when we are struggling with a budget to meet our needs of all of our citizens. So that's the point that I wanted to make, and I would like to be certain that that is something that we discuss as a commission as we go down the road, because this is density. And we will be increasing all the little feet walking around and all the, you see all these people talk about the affordable housing problem that it brings with police and everything, but these bring the same types of issues: domestic violence, stolen cars, kids being truant. And getting into trouble. Okay. People speeding with their bicycles. Chris, I'm just kidding, Chris. But all of that, we've got to put a line here where we're giving away our services to help developers increase their profit. And unfortunately, the same thing goes for our property owners of our city. So that's my conservative moment of the night.
Will we have a chance to look at the impact fees that the city currently has, the different categories and what they are, and to think through, or is that not part of our docket and agenda?
I'm still trying to wrap my arms around where Chair Thompson was going with that last comment, but I think if I could summarize, it would be, should middle housing pay the same impact fees as single-family homes? That's what I got out of that. So hopefully I'm right. In terms of impact fees, that is probably something that the commission would not be looking at. The transportation impact fees were adopted in 2022, and we asked our engineer if they were in compliance with the recent state law on impact fees that was passed in 2022, and the answer was yes. We'll also be updating the park impact fees, but that's usually in the council's purview in terms of looking at impact fees and setting impact fees.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Olson?
Yeah, so I think one thing I wanted to cover as far as impact fees go and utility connections and those types of things. In my opinion, those costs should be tied to the action of upping your utility size, right? If you need a larger water line because you have 3 units instead of 1, that's when I would think you'd pay the utility impact fee, right? If you're able to make do with the existing infrastructure that is sized and appropriate for maybe a single family or even potentially a duplex, I don't see how that has a significant burden or impact on the rest of the community. You are better utilizing existing resources, and you are then paying for those resources through the same utility lines. On the other hand, I see your point about potentially having people try to use it as a loophole, let's say, to build really tall houses or something, right? And then convert it back. That is kind of, I think, the concern I have with impact fees is do we apply an impact fee if we take an existing house and convert it? And in my opinion, I would think we probably shouldn't, because otherwise the incentive is to keep it the same and not change it ever, or to demo it all and make as much money as you possibly can. You wouldn't want to change it to fit your needs. You would want to make sure you're within those codes and guidelines, because to change it to fit your needs now means you are going to potentially have to pay an impact fee. So that would be my concern with that is, I think it really depends on whether or not you're constructing something new or demolishing something old. And so I would think it would depend on, is it existing or not? So going back to the Commissioner LaSalle's point about visioning, to me, I think the crux of it is it existing, or is it and a modification of an existing unit or property, or is it a demolition of an existing property and a reconstruction by a developer or a contractor? Those are very, very different things. I would also add the cost of demolition alone and the cost of acquisition and the cost of time to build these places makes that a less enticing goal. Like, most people aren't going to take 3 flats and turn them back into a single family house. That's a very expensive thing to do. And frankly, the people that are going to do that, they're already paying for it through the cost of construction. Right? And that has a cost to the community potentially, and a reduced number of units, that type of thing. But I think the point I want to make is flexibility in code is fundamental and important for missing middle to work. And I think that flexibility has kind of 2 different types. One is to David Dorian's previous point about diversity of housing types, which is something I think is very important. And I would like to echo Commissioner Dorian's point with that. So how do we allow for flexibility while not being so flexible that we get a bunch of demolishments and slot houses, right? On the other hand, how do we also allow for individuals with their houses to turn it into a duplex or a stacked flat, if that makes sense? And at the same time recognize that going the other direction, if they took a triplex and turned it into a single family house, we wouldn't necessarily, give them new impact fee assessments for that house. If they upsized the utility because they decided that they wanted to put in, I don't know, a swimming pool in the back, maybe that's something different, right? I don't think you have to upsize utilities for a swimming pool, so that's probably a bad example. But I guess that's the point there. I think these are conversations we should keep exploring, but I'm not necessarily against impact fees for new construction of missing middle housing, to be clear. It's like any other housing, and people should pay for the schools that we go to and the streets that we walk on. But I think potentially tying those things more directly to the actual action that has a greater cost in the community might be a better way of trying to get out of this definitions game and more towards, okay, what is the actual action that's going to be taken, right? Are we adding additional square footage of area for places to live that's going to dramatically increase density, or are we telling people, hey, you're living in a smaller unit and we're getting density that way? I think those are kind of different things fundamentally on what the impacts are. So.
Commissioner Dorian?
One thing that I'm thinking about is that I'm aware we can't have code that is more restrictive on the middle housing types than it is on single family homes. But given some of the communication that we've had from the public, I'm wondering what the Commission's perspective would be on code that is less restrictive than single family homes for middle housing types, meaning they would be able to have more impervious surfaces, they would be able to have lower setbacks, etc. I think we've been given the sense from communication from various different members of the public that is considered necessary, and not just members of the public, actually trade bodies as well got in touch with us and suggested this, that's necessary for the production of the middle housing to realistically occur. So a couple of points around that, questions, I guess. I would struggle if we just changed our code entirely and allowed single family homes to have the same differences from current code. So if we were to allow single family homes to have a greater impervious surfaces or less setbacks, etc. I would also wonder, given we just said we're probably not going to look at impact fees, if there are ways we can use those kind of things as incentives to drive some of the diversity that we're looking for, so that only certain types of middle housing would get that sort of advantage of the restrictions being less restrictive than single family homes. So that's kind of some initial thoughts, but also I'm interested in how the rest of the Commission feel about this question of, do we say like it's exactly the same footprint as a single family home, or are we allowing middle housing to have a slightly different footprint than a single family home?
Do you have anything else for right now, Commissioner Dorian?
Nope, that's me.
Questions, and I think that maybe some commissioners will address them in their comments. First, Commissioner Vanderlyn, and then Commissioner Macias.
Thank you. I'd like to remind folks that allowing missing middle, the amount of flexibility we'd be adding to this is going to create the opportunity for great profit for developers. I personally don't see the need for any incentive beyond that, particularly when those incentives are likely just to go into the developer's pocket anyway. They're not going to reduce costs, and they're not going to change what type of development they're going to do. They're going to go for the highest buck they can get. So what we have in order to shape what our city is going to look like in the future in these areas in R1, R4, and R6 is going to be the design and the code that we're talking about right now. So when we get to the point of saying, do we want to allow more impervious surfaces in order to incent missing middle? I don't think we need to do that, and I don't think that's a public goal that we should be striving for. I think that the idea of having missing middle be compatible with our existing housing stock in our single-family areas is the right way to go. And the way to do that is to keep to the single-family setbacks, the single-family design requirements that are there right there. So you can add a missing middle. You can have increased flexibility in what you can build, but it has to still be compatible with the neighborhood that it's being built into. There's going to be plenty of profit in that. You don't need to look very far to look California, you look at Denver, you look at any other place where missing middle is taken off. What you see is no shy of developers into moving in and developing there. Particularly in our situation where we've got the Growth Management Act that's going to absolutely create an upward growth in the value of property and in rents. You're going to see, again, missing middle being seen as a very good investment, and you're going to see development happen. Again, I don't see why we need to give up anything on the city side to encourage that more. I don't think you're going to need any additional encouragement. Just to extend this a little bit, the other side of this is we do have a structural budget deficit. It has existed for years and years, and there's no real end to it out in sight. As long as you have a cap out there, which I won't argue for or against, that's always going to be a problem. To the extent that you say this group of taxpayers are exempt, means that all the remaining taxpayers are going to have to carry that burden. Again, I don't think that's something that our missing middle needs to have, that type of incentive, that side of tax relief is really necessary. If they can't carry their burden when we know that they're going to have a significant profit, whether that comes through impact fees, whether that comes from property taxes, whether that comes from use fees like utility use fees, indifferent to that. But there has to be a contribution or we're just going to contribute to that perpetual budget deficit. And if you don't, and be given the cap on this, you can't even pass that cost on to the remaining taxpayers. Cap won't let you do that. You can't increase the property tax enough to do that. So what's going to happen? It's going to be services. So what will we have? We'll have more density, more population, and an ability to be able to service them. So I really caution against, and I'm really opposed, and I can be talked out of this, but I just don't see where we need to subsidize missing middle development.
So Commissioner Macias and then Commissioner Olson.
I'm in complete agreement with keeping our regulations on setbacks and impervious surface. I think one of the incentives to build missing middle is that we are changing our R1 zones to R4 and R6. And I'm coming about this in a little different way. You know, when we spoke about missing middle, it is to fit into existing single family homes and lots and building heights and setbacks. And that was the appeal. And I think we hold to that. And also our setbacks is where people have gardens and it's where people have privacy and yards and tree canopies. And I think for me personally, I have very little appetite to increase impervious surface and add more concrete when our council's main goal is climate and keeping our green spaces. And this is exactly where we see them. So I do not want to see code where that changes.
Commissioner Olson.
Yeah, so first thing I wanted to just get some clarification around the taxes is the concern effectively that if the number of units don't officially increase, let's say a bunch of people build ADUs, like we get hundreds and hundreds of them, let's say, just to make the math more explicit, then because the city cannot increase the gross property tax receipts over a certain amount and it's not considered a new unit, that the total amount that the city is able to impose on people is effectively less than, or less for people who have single family houses and ADUs, and therefore the burden of the property taxes shifted onto people without ADUs. Is that the concern, Commissioner Vanderlyn? Sorry, I just want to be clear on that.
I think we're in agreement. I don't know.
Commissioner Vanderlyn, could you say that into the mic and then
sorry.
Vice
I don't
Chair
think we're
Thompson, would
disagreeing
you like
here.
to say something?
Okay,
I think we're saying the same thing.
No, perfect. I just wanted to
That
clarify.
there is a potential here to shift the cost of property taxes from one payer group to the next. And I would be opposed to that.
Commissioner Olson, could you just state your question one more time, please?
Yeah, my question is simply, sorry. My question was confirming that I was understanding Commissioner Vanderlin's concerns correctly. I suppose my first thought there is when your property value increases at a rate faster than your neighbors, your property taxes go up faster than your neighbors. So I would think that would be accounted for in this. That being said, I do see the challenge with the structural deficit, right? That doesn't fix the underlying problem, especially if you do see an increase in utilities and services, but I don't think you're necessarily not paying your fair share. So I just wanted to check that first. The other piece of this, as far as incentives that I wanted to voice, going to Commissioner Dorian's point, I think, and this is the line that we need to draw. I don't think I disagree with anything that has been stated. The goal is not to increase impervious surface area. The goal is not to provide incentives specifically for missing middle. On the other hand, the type of missing middle that we will see, I think, is very predictable if we don't have incentives in a certain direction. And I'm using the words incentives, but really what I'm saying, what I'm trying to get at is the design flexibility to allow for the types of missing middle housing that we want to see. If we keep setbacks, I suspect we're more likely to see things like slot homes, because if you have to avoid a tree, you're going to angle the house away from the roadway towards a skinny driveway. And if we don't allow the flexibility in the code and require a variance, it would not be a surprise to me at all to see only that type of housing be built on those types of lots, because we don't provide the flexibility for anything else. And I don't think we'd be happy with those outcomes necessarily. So I understand the concerns around increasing the allowances. And I don't think incentive is necessarily the right word, or potentially it is. When I think of the word incentive, I think this is getting into semantics and definitions, which this is, my personal definition, but it is an exchange effectively, right? We're saying you can increase the height of this building so as not to increase impervious surface area and to make this thing a viable project that it would not otherwise be. And so you can definitely build missing middle within the confines of the code as allowed by single family limitations. I don't think that's a question. I just don't think it's the type of missing middle housing we're going to want to see in our city, is my concern. So what I'm curious is, how can we ensure the types of missing middle housing that we see don't increase the impervious surface area, right? What are the fundamental things we really don't want to see? We don't want to see impervious surface areas. We want to see private spaces and buffers and green spaces in single family areas. But at the same time, how do we allow for the flexibility and the encouragement through perhaps exchanges of standards to ensure the types of missing middle housing we have are not slot houses, but we get actual townhouses or stacked flats or et cetera. A couple ideas that I've been throwing around are things like potentially not having the same rear setback, but you say, okay, you need a 20-foot setback and 2 5-foot setbacks, and then the front setback of 20 feet. But you can pick which side has the 20-foot setback, or maybe you do a 10-foot setback and 2 5-foot setbacks. So the total is the same potentially, but you give that flexibility to the individual property or to the developer or the property owner, whoever it may be, to meet other codes that we deem more important, such as property impervious surface area maximums, et cetera, such as parking. One other thing I would point out with DADUs that I've heard previously is you have a DADU in the back and there isn't a drive to it. I grew up in a house that was a duplex and I did not have a parking garage or a driveway. I had to walk to my house and it worked. It was fine. The bigger issue that we ran into is, how does fire get to that house? How does a fire truck get there, right? You don't necessarily have to have a driveway for a fire truck to get there. The fire truck can connect a hose and run, I think it's about 100 feet or so from a fire hydrant. So long as we have those other utilities, I don't think we necessarily have to have driveways. So one other flexibility that I could see is for ADUs or duplexes or cottage housing, for instance, not requiring individual drives or not requiring parking garages, and that could be seen as an incentive from the perspective of single-family housing construction, because it is a burden that single-family houses typically have. But on the other hand, it is the nature of that type of housing. And it allows for a flexibility that's going to, in my opinion, provide higher quality housing without necessarily increasing price or increasing impervious surface area. So anyways, I just wanted to voice those thoughts there, because I don't think we're necessarily in disagreement. I just want to like kind of get down to that.
Thank you, Commissioner Olson, Vice Chair Thompson, and then I would like to say something.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner Olson. I'm going to stay away from that last dialogue completely. It's going to be one of our major points to get over. But let's talk about the tax deal. So if you build an addition to your house today, and you start today, which is February 4th, and you finish it in August or September of this year, what they're going to do is they're going to come out and they're going to appraise, the tax appraiser's going to appraise the house. And generally they don't go inside, they walk around the outside and they take measurements and things like that. To determine square footage of livable or square footage of garage, right? And they give you that, they'll do the assessment and give you a notice with your time to appeal, and then that will come to pass at the next setting of the value of the property, which is always January 1st. Don't pay your taxes on that appraisal until the following year, normally, if I understand this properly. A lot of people think that's what they do, but they don't. So that is not subject to the 1%. So you're going to be taxed on that whole assessment because it's new construction. And new construction is added on, and you get taxed at your current rate that you're taxed on. And you're right about it's the 1%, and 1% is done by, in effect, the city can raise their budget. If they had $1 million that they assessed this year, so next year they can only increase that by 1% unless they get an exception or by the voters. And then that is divided down into our taxes. It's not exactly that our taxes are going up 1% or down or below 1%. You have to take a look at all the stuff. And in addition, the levies that we pass, like for the school district, that doesn't count. We're stuck with that. That's on top of the 1% and everything else. And and this is the problem that the city has. It's not 1% on all of our property. It's 1% of their budget. That's all they can raise it by. And I believe I've been through enough of these taxes. I think that's about it. I mean, there's a little weird stuff in between, but just wanted to let you know, if you're gonna add on 500 square feet for your house, you're gonna be paying for it sometime in the near future.
Oh, yeah.
I'm going to say something and then Commissioner Olson. So I have a few things. Some of them came from emails that I think most of us received, and then some are things that I want to just plus one my colleagues on. So one is somebody wrote in about a pre-approved, she called it a DADU program, but I think you could have a pre-approved ADU program as well. So I just wanted to put that on the table as something that we could talk about. Oh, do you want to say something, Debbie?
No, I was going to say, yeah, I saw that same email and that could be sort of a future work program item that would likely fall under development services if they wanted to look at, do some research on what other jurisdictions have done with
Yeah.
pre-approved plans, the cost, the use and that kind of thing. So I think
Yeah.
that might be sort of potentially an incentive, but I don't know enough about it. And I think it's sort of outside the scope of this, but you could sort of say, perhaps the city should explore this in the future, is how I
Okay.
would approach that.
Great. And then somebody else wrote in about irregularly shaped lots. I'm not really sure what that means for our conversation, but I wanted to raise it in case there are things that we should consider.
Typically, you don't kind of write code they just are. And then it's how the codes are applied to an irregularly shaped lot. So it creates some challenges in terms of applying the code, but I don't think we would write a separate code specifically for an irregularly shaped lot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm not sure how Kenmore has applied. Debbie would be able to answer them, but in my experience in working with multiple jurisdictions, that's exactly right. You draft a code that addresses pretty much all circumstances, and then if on a case-by-case basis, there's something called a director's interpretation. So depending on a specific situation, the director has the authority to assess the code, accordingly, depending on that particular case. So hopefully that makes sense.
Yes, it does. I think these other things are going to be kind of plus ones. I am interested, this goes back to something Commissioner LaSalle said, and it was reverberated, I think, in some other comments as well. I am interested in hearing more from our community about height and talking more about height in general. I think we can talk about it when we're thinking about middle housing, but I think I'd like to have a conversation more broadly about that because I think that I've heard that we want to avoid some things like urban canyons and we want to do things like maintain view sheds. And so I think that people have lots of opinions and feelings and views on height for those reasons. I think those are valid concerns, reasonable goals. But I've also heard that we have other goals like reducing impervious surface and maintaining our tree canopy. And sometimes building up can be a good way to meet those goals instead of encouraging sprawl. So one concept that I've been reading about is lot sprawl. So the idea of like on a lot, you can either kind of let the buildings sprawl out, or you can kind of try to kind of consolidate them. So I have a question about kind of the benefits over DADUs versus ADUs, as if we wanted to kind of discourage lot sprawl, we might want to think about encouraging ADUs rather than DADUs, but I don't know if that's the direction we want to go. So that's a lot and another, but a plus one. And then I think I also do have concerns about making sure that we're not just allowing these 6 housing types, but that we'll actually see them built. I do have concerns about the pattern of development that we have encouraged by our code over the last, couple decades. We're getting these big houses that just take up the whole lot. And I don't know what it's going to take to change that, but it feels like a developer is going to build what they can build the most easily for the most profit. And it feels like I'd like us to think about what we need to do to maybe we can make it so that a developer makes more money building the kind of types of housing that we want to see. So how we do that is, I don't know exactly, but maybe there's some things like Commissioner Olson was talking about where like, I don't know, we talk about front and back or setbacks or something, like the kinds of regulations that maybe are not as hot button an issue, although I don't know, maybe setbacks are. Yeah, I'm not saying that I personally would recommend this, but for example, in Seattle in 2019, they proposed to reduce the allowed size of new houses on lots, but exempt ADUs from counting toward the size limit to kind of give developers, you know, like you can either build this sized house or you can build more if you make them ADUs. Again, that's not something that I'm personally recommending, but things like that I would be interested in exploring. And then, yeah, I just wanted +1 also Commissioner Olson's kind of thinking about the difference between new construction and remodeling or repurposing current or old construction. And when I think about them in my head, I do feel they're different in some way. Like for some reason with existing construction, I do think about families kind of changing the structure of their home to fit their needs. And when I think about things like imposing more impact fees on them or requiring that their entrance to the second house be in a certain place, or that they put in a new parking spot, or that they provide sidewalks, like for me, all those things would be huge disincentives for doing something to my own home, because they would cost a lot more money than I have, frankly. But then when I think about a developer coming in and clearing a lot and then putting in multiple units, that does somehow feel different to me. And I don't know if it's fair or if we have the ability to make that difference, but that's another thing that I think about a lot. So I think those are all of my ideas for now. So I think Commissioner Olson, did you want to say something?
I have something based off what you just said, but frankly, I completely forgot what I had queued up. Off of what you just said, I think I do have a concern, even with the existing versus not existing, in its ability to be used as an effective loophole. I think there's some things that mitigate it as a loophole, but I just wanted to voice this to the commission. One example I could see is going, I think Commissioner Thompson mentioned, sorry, Vice Chair Thompson mentioned potential tree regulations that don't necessarily apply to ADUs and DADUs, for instance. And I could see that being used as, okay, let's say I'm a developer, I buy a lot, I cut down a tree and build a DADU, and then I demo everything and build whatever else I want. Now I get around the tree regulation, right? The disincentive to that obviously is the cost of construction of a DADU. So I think it's a pretty roundabout loophole that probably wouldn't be practiced or very effective, but I did just want to bring up, there are some downsides potentially to those types of incentives that are worth contemplating, if nothing else. I personally think that particular loophole is unlikely to be taken advantage of unless you have a very, very large tree that would impose very large fines, and you're able to build a lot of housing on that lot that could offset the cost and the price difference. And so potentially mitigate things like that by having higher impact fees for new construction, or maybe not higher, but maybe more in line with single family housing. So that way there's a further disincentive to try and take advantage of it in that manner. And also a further incentive through not having those same impact fees to maintain housing stock. Or maintain/improve existing housing stock. Yeah, I did just want to say thank you, Chair Thompson, for your explanation. I previously, in my statement around taxes, my understanding, which in retrospect, I don't know why I made this assumption, was that it was new units or a new building or something along those lines. But you're right, a new construction period is an additional tax, at which point I would think ADUs and DADUs are going to end up paying taxes at some point in time. And I think that kind of further lends credence to people are paying their fair share in those respects. So anyways, thank you.
Commissioner LaSalle?
Yeah, just to follow up on the part that Commissioner Olson made, I think, I feel, and I'd love to hear feedback from the commission as well as from you. I feel as though the issue is less enhancement versus just tearing everything down and rebuilding it, and is more about what is the occupancy of the new building, either net new building or enhanced building. And going back to some houses are just impractical to build upon. But if they were converted by tearing them down and replacing them, what I feel matters is less about how do we, the fact that we tore it down, and more about what is the end product and how much space is it occupying on the lot versus the initial house. So yeah, I know there's challenges for heights, but if we want to preserve the greenery that is Kenmore, I think it's important to consider as well that whether it's a net new construction or it's a conversion on an existing building, the challenge is making sure that what we end up with is not a house whose building to lot ratio is just 1, and maybe have a smaller number than that.
Yes, I share that concern as well. Commissioner Vanderlyn?
Yes, going back to the subject of flexibility, whether we're talking about differences in design or we're talking about odd-shaped lots, those discussions that would then go back to a director within the city to negotiate or to make a determination. One of the things that I picked up in the regulations, the new 1110, was that those sorts of reviews can only be administrative. And I'm not exactly sure what administrative means. It'd be good to have a better understanding of that, so when we write the code, we can make sure that we're writing code that's going to be not lead us to some unintended consequence. Maybe that's not possible.
Yeah, well, I think that the challenges that you've been discussing tonight, are how to write a flexible, compatible code that allows for diversity of types, that preserves green space, and also encourages a smaller footprint. Something when we write code has got to give. So I think when we I think what you're struggling with right now is it's having this conversation without something concrete to review. I think once you see a first draft, you'll be able to have sort of a discussion around what is a concrete, no pun then, a proposal, and whether we flex the right things or not to achieve the goals. So I get what you're saying, and that's something that we will try and bring back to you. Writing code is not perfect. You cannot anticipate every possible thing. But what you write code for is you regulate requirements that you feel more strongly about, and you are flexible on those that you don't mind about so much. So if you care about things like footprint, then being clear on things like a ratio for ratio of a building size or level of impervious surface, those are things which I'm hearing that you care more about than maybe how it looks in terms of a design. In terms of height, maybe you might want to flex a little bit, and maybe a little bit around height if it preserves some of these other things. So again, once we bring a code back to you, you will be able to see how we've tried to flex some of those requirements in being either more prescriptive or being, having more flexibility in there. So I completely get what you're all saying, and we'll do our best to bring something back that reflects the things that you've said are important when writing the code.
Commissioner Dorian?
Yeah, thank you. I guess interestingly on building heights, I was just scanning through the guide on ADUs, and they actually call out Kenmore's municipal code around building heights for ADUs because the state law is allowing height of 24 feet, and we allow 35 feet for ADUs, but with some other stipulations that make it extremely unlikely that an ADU would reach 35 feet. So we also have code that states that an ADU can only have 1 story above a garage or be 2 stories if built from the ground. So that would have to be very large stories if we were going to get to 35 feet, I think. So it's just kind of interesting from the height approach, but also from the things that we can do within code that give us um, that greater flexibility with different housing types. Because I mean, 35 feet I think is consistent with our single family homes, but those other regulations specific to ADUs mean that you couldn't build an ADU that was the same size as a single family home, really. That was kind of interesting. The other things that came up in that quick scan, there's mention about prefabricated ADUs, and perhaps that local authorities might need to consider that when writing code. There was, I don't know if this will be relevant to us based on our other code, but short-term rentals. So something that's recommended is to take a look at short-term rental usage and whether a local authority would allow that within ADUs as well. So just sharing those as things related to code specific to ADUs.
Thank you, Commissioner Dorian. Commissioner Vanderlyn, and then Vice Chair Thompson.
Yes, related to the 35-foot height, there was significant discussion about this when we were going through the original ADU requirements. And there was a consensus among, not all, but a consensus among members of the council at the time that ADUs should be allowed for a cathedral ceiling height. And it would be discriminatory if we didn't do that. We might want to revisit that.
That is interesting history, Commissioner Vanderlyn. Thank you. And Vice Chair Thompson.
Advantage of age.
Oh, Commissioner Vanderveen, you know, you're Vanderleen. I'm sorry. That's really good. That's one of the better comebacks on the 35-foot. I could just see this little itty bitty, you know, Lego pieces that we gave you the other day, just kind of built one on top of another there. So I wanted to thank Commissioner Dorian. You know, you come up with some of the best new stuff that I, you know, haven't even dreamed about. It's like, you know, listening to you at the commission is like reading your Facebook. I just not sure what's coming next, but it's all good. I couldn't help myself but say that. I'm sorry, Madam Chair. But now to the points that I wanted to bring up. So let's start with Chair Banazinski's discussion about the split home, if I may call it that. And that was 2 families living in one home. Excellent, excellent point. We know that in many other countries, this is the norm, not the exception. And in some of the less wealthy parts of our country, that is also a common occurrence. Also, you could look at it from a generational home too. Well, there's a couple of items there. So first of all, how do you count that? Because you have a shared kitchen, and by law, RCW, I believe, in order to have, help me here, something called a house, you have to have a kitchen in it. and of course a toilet. I think there's, there, or to occupy it as such. I think there's something in the law about that. Does that ring a bell?
There's probably something in the building code that spells that out. But where are you going with this?
And where I'm going with that is, so um, the middle housing, in order for us to count that as 2 homes, which in fact it is, we'd have to have 2 kitchens and whatever else is required by the normal code for counting homes, which creates a problem. And of course, the other issue is that each home, when you have a separate homeowner, you have to have separate utilities. And I think that's also somewhere in the RCW, I don't know, it's always a problem. I don't know how we're going to get around those kinds of hurdles, but I certainly like that idea. And if we could figure out a way to get over the hurdles and be one of the first cities to inaugurate that concept for middle housing, I think we might even make the Seattle Times on that one. But I think it's a good deal, and it's forward thinking.
Can I ask you a question of clarification? Do you mean the conversion of our split level?
No,
No, something different.
just like what you
Just-
said.
Okay. Thank you.
1 home, 2 families, right? Instead of 2 houses and 2 families. I mean, 2 separate houses, 2 families. That's what you were referring to, correct? 1 home, 2 families.
Yes, I wasn't necessarily, I mean, they could be separated by a locked door or not, but yeah. I was thinking about conversion of our split level homes into, duplexes or a stacked flat with 2 or something like that. I don't know what you want to call it, but that's what I was thinking of.
Well, and, I got in trouble in front of the city council for referring to one of our fellow cities. So instead, I will talk about Lake City as a general area. And if you drive around there, you'll see the 3 townhomes or 3 sort of townhomes on a single family lot. Or you'll see 5 on a double family lot or more. And I'm just trying to figure out in my mind conceptually how we're going to prevent that from happening in our single family residential areas, because I hear from our public as well as a lot of other folks, that have been appointed or elected, that we want to keep Kenmore a livable city in the same manner that it is now. And if we start having, lots of 3 townhouses on them, or whatever you call them, they look like townhouses, and they start popping up everywhere, that's not going to end up looking like what we have now or anything that we've been considering. And I'm not sure how we can help not make that happen.
Can I ask another question of clarification? By the 3 townhomes, do you mean like the slot townhomes?
Slots,
The slots, yeah,
Slot, whatever you want to call them,
yeah.
right? and I'm not talking about down here by the, in the, what, like the parts close to 522. I'm talking about up in our regular neighborhoods. That's a grave concern, I know, of the public, and it's a concern to me. I drive around several cities around here, and I see those buildings being built and already built. And I just see that I fear, and I think that's a rational fear, that that type of development is going to happen in Kenmore.
All right. Does anybody else have any ideas that haven't been surfaced that Debbie and Todd, you want Debbie and Todd to consider as they're moving forward? Commissioner Olson?
This is something that I have heard, but I frankly have not done a ton of research on it. And so I just want to voice it more to staff in hopes that either they have information on this or couldn't find information on it. But ADU amnesty policies, amnesty. So there are not very many ADUs officially registered from what I've seen. And I know there have been many illegally built ADUs. I know other cities have implemented amnesty policies, but I haven't looked into them very much. So I'm just curious what they look like. What are the pros, cons, a kind of high level review, and if you have any awareness of that. If not, this could be for a future meeting. I also just wanted to voice it to the rest of the commission that this is a thing that has been done in other places. Basically, people would do what they needed to do and they would do it under the table and not get it permitted. And that has implications that I don't necessarily like, but I just wanted to mention ADU amnesty policies as a point of curiosity. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is, if nothing else, just to have a more accurate total of how many ADUs are actually in the city. Like, I think it says there's 12.
We have that number, Todd, right? We gave that number before, the number of
Yeah, it's just
ADUs.
over 120-ish. It's in the housing element. We noted it. So I was just looking it up earlier. And
Oh, okay.
so that's permitted, 120 ADUs, but
it might not be an issue in our city or particularly.
yeah, I mean,
large issue. I just
inevitably,
wanted
there's
to ask.
always some out there that, you know, it may be an ADU, a house, or anything could be added on to that we don't know about unless somebody, you know, goes out and, you know, a neighbor reports it or something like that. Like the city doesn't actively go seeking, you know, we don't drive up and down every street of Kenmore looking for code violators. That's just not how it works.
This is more
Yeah.
to get people who have, my understanding,
Yeah.
like I said, this is cursory. I have not thoroughly researched this, but my understanding is more just to get a more accurate number for
Yeah.
people that perhaps made adjustments previously and then didn't get them permitted at that time, to have them come in and get it permitted to more accurately assess where you're at with some of these policies. The downside to amnesty that I have concerns about are safety, frankly. Like, do they meet egress requirements? Do they, right? There's certain fundamental assessments. Did they get L&I inspection for electrical? That's a big one. That being said, I think some of those things are doable with an amnesty policy. You can check breaker boxes and see if they got electrical inspections for any electrical work that was done. You can check window egresses and make sure that they actually have those egresses met. Make sure that there aren't more than 2 units on a lot that would ostensibly have utility access for 2 units. But like I said, I need to look into it more. This also does not necessarily remove fees or anything along those lines to officially get it permitted, but just give people an out as opposed to potentially being reported and it coming back in the future. Yeah, to your point, city isn't going around and checking these things. The other thing that I wanted to mention was around, I think you mentioned this, with Seattle's pre-approved ADU plans. I met with, I believe it's Catherine who sent that email this last Saturday and had a conversation with her. And one of the things she mentioned around that is the preference. She really liked the way Seattle went around about that, as opposed to just having the city go and pay to get a bunch of plans, because if you pay for a bunch of different plans, you don't know if those plans are going to be popular or desirable for people in the city. And so the way Seattle did it instead was they had plans that people use and they had to pay for the plans up front. But then once a plan had been implemented and people showed interest and that it was a desirable plan, that's when it became a pre-approved plan. And that seems like a much more efficient, methodical way, frankly, of having some sort of pre-approval system. Maybe I missed what Tracy's comment was earlier, and I might be reiterating that. But if we do end up looking into pre-approved plans, I'm more interested in an approach like that. The other thing is, it sounds like there is a fee that the city would charge to use those pre-approved plans. It's probably not going to, make the city any money, but at least to have some cost associated with that, since you're going to ostensibly be saving the developer or property owner the cost of getting a new design or new plan. I think those are all the things I wanted to mention. At this point, oh, sorry, yes, there was one more thing. The last thing is I spoke with Jim Howard as well on Saturday, and he has very different concerns than Catherine. And one of his concerns that he stated was having, tall buildings, we reduce rear setbacks, and you've got duplex or an ADU and people are able to stare into the neighbors' yards. I think there's potential solutions for some of these things, like hazed glass, other, frankly, code and design solutions that are more along, an exchange, right? An allowance for one thing if you do this other thing, right? Kind of like we already have with, I think it's like what, we allow 9 units on an acre if you build an affordable housing unit or something along those lines, right? So these alternative allowances, and looking into features like that, right? Like you can't, we don't want people to be staring into your neighbor's yard necessarily or have these negative impacts on neighbors, but at the same time, I don't want to unduly limit what can be built on a property and really provide that flexibility. So I just wanted to voice those 3 items, and also to the rest of the commission.
Okay, any other ideas from commissioners that haven't been talked about? Okay, Todd and Debbie, do you have any questions for us about things we didn't bring up?
Things you didn't bring up?
That you are thinking about that we didn't bring up that you'd like to ask us about?
Nope, I don't think so. Like I say, we've heard some ideas, some thoughts on how codes should be applied, some sort of principles to keep in mind when developing code. So I think all good feedback. We'll pass this along to our consultant, and the next step at your next meeting is to review draft code. Yes.
Yeah, I think, like Debbie said, I think once you get a code in front of you and are be able to digest that first draft and visualize it and have a conversation with Clay and Nick, that'll help answer some of these questions, probably bring up new ones, and it's just going to be evolving over the next couple of months. And so but we'll certainly pass along your feedback as they're developing the code over the next week or so. And then we'll kind of start with draft number 1 and kind of work from there. So this is kind of an iterative process. And like we've said before, even during the comp plan process, you probably heard Debbie and I say, we're not going to be able to solve all the problems or issues in one round. And like I mentioned before, the state, even as we speak, is meeting to discuss even new things that they want to add on to, and we're going to find challenges, loopholes, all kinds of things. So just know that when this is adopted, this is an end-all be-all of the code, and that this is going to be an evolving thing over multiple years. We're going to see bumps and bruises along the way, and something's going to get built that are like, hey, whoa, wait a minute, that shouldn't have, you know, I mean, that's kind of the nature of code writing and getting these things right that work out. I mean, right now, we're trying to just get something that is the best that we can for the amount of time that we have, so that the state code doesn't preempt everything, and then we kind of work from there. So that's kind of how we're treating it, but we obviously don't want to rush, but we want to try to address as many of your concerns. I think Debbie said it well, you know, there's going to be a little bit of give and take here. We can't get everything into the, the mix, so anyway.
Commissioner Vanderlin?
Yeah, we've been kind of shadow boxing here tonight without that draft code in front of us. And I'd be happy to see us get out of that mode next week.
Yep.
Is there any chance that we could see that draft before the meeting? Because I think coming prepared.
It'll be in the packet.
It'll be in the packet, yeah, absolutely,
Thank you.
yeah. So they're drafting it right now, and it'll be part of the packet with, you know, the week prior or so, as soon as we can get it sent to you. Usually it's within the week, so it should be about a week or so from now, and yeah.
And again, once you've received it and had the opportunity to review it, if you have questions, comments in advance of
Yeah.
the meeting, please
Yeah.
let us know, because it's easier to answer questions if you know them in advance. And I understand that, you know, questions come up at the meeting, that's fine. But any burning questions in advance, please pass them along.
So, Vice Chair Thompson?
Looking at the schedule coming up, it looks as though, and I just want to make sure I understand what I'm reading, that March 4th is going to be the point in which we move a draft of the regulation to public hearing.
Well, so we have it, the next two meetings are intended for review and discussion. So that would be both the 18th, getting my dates right, and the 4th. Then potentially an additional meeting if needed. We're not ready yet, because the first date that I put on there was the second meeting of March for a potential public hearing, but the latest that we'd want to have a hearing would be April 1st, so that gives enough time for the council to be able, well, you have to give your recommendations, of course, to the council in April, and then they are going to need 2 full months to review in order to meet the June 30th deadline. So the drop dead date really for a hearing out of Planning Commission will be April 1st. So you've got 1, 2, and then the hearing night 3 to kind of get through all of that. Get it to council. So yeah.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
And I'm not familiar with, haven't looked at the model code. How many pages of code would you just guess? Now, this is a guess that we're going to end up having to review and recommend.
I don't know, because again, there's not only the code, the zoning code, there are these other codes that will have to be changed so everything matches together. So it might look like a lot of pages because there has to be consistency. So let's just start off with getting the draft middle housing code sorted out first. How many pages that will be, I don't want to guess. It'll be how long's a piece of string? I don't know. We'll make it as manageable as we can. And if there's a good way for us to summarize that for you, that's what we'll do. So I don't know.
And I appreciate that.
It's not
I was
going to
just
be
trying
hundreds
get
of pages. It really isn't.
an idea, because code, we have to really look at the detail in the wording and that, and I'm just going to take a deep breath and get ready for our next meeting. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Commissioner Olson?
Sorry, I had more thoughts. I'll try to keep this pretty straightforward. So we have 6 of the 9 allowable different housing types, and I was thinking more about flexibility and rethinking about Tracy's, Commissioner Banasinski's comments around competing priorities, and also that something has to give, right? Like you can't have 2 things that are mutually exclusive. I remember at some point we discussed having zones potentially where we would, you could limit housing, like building heights and that type of thing potentially additionally, or we discussed having parking requirements further away from downtown. Is it possible to potentially have, I guess, restrictions in certain areas with the intent that it effectively incentivizes certain types of the 6 allowable, that, they could technically build any of them if they're able to on a particular parcel, but instead of trying to, come up with this idealistic vision, instead just look at the constraints of regions in Kenmore, whether you're on a hill overlooking Lake Washington or you're further from downtown.
But, I mean, that's not typically how zoning is done for typical single-family zones. We don't go to that level of detail. You have the code requirements, and then when they're in place, and then if somebody wants to build, then at that time, you come in and you take a look at what are the individual lot constraints. But to do that and write code to address areas, you'd have to do that lot by lot. That is not practical. That happens at the time of an individual permit application.
I think yep, that answers that. Thank you.
Okay, so just to summarize on our meetings, we have 3 meetings to review the middle housing code. And then we will likely go to a public hearing on April 1st, not on March 18th.
Yeah, I mean,
Let's see where we get to. So
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
let's kind of hope for the best, and then, but let's see what it looks like at next week or the next meeting that we have, the level of discussion we have, and then we'll be able to see, do we need that extra meeting or not? So I think let's just kind of hold off making a final decision on the public hearing date at this point.
Yeah. Yeah, no,
I would
that's
recommend.
totally fine with me. I feel like past experience has showed me that we usually need more rather than less time, but I am totally open to seeing how it goes. And in that spirit too, I don't think we'll get into a lot of like line editing probably in the first round of revisions, but if you do have any things that are just line editing, just email them to Todd and Debbie so that we don't have to spend time in the meeting talking about those things. Yes, so anything else from you, Todd and Debbie, for us? No, okay. So I personally, now this is the good of the order. So I personally would like to say there's a lot going on in the world. And so thank you to commissioners and staff for showing up tonight in the midst of all the things that are going on in the world. I appreciate your care and your presence here for our community. Is there anything else for the good of the order? Vice Chair Thompson?
I would like the commission to say happy birthday to Madam Chair. Happy birthday. Happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
Thank you.
I won't
No, it's not
discuss,
today.
yeah, I won't discuss any further details because she will shoot me. Okay.
All right. With nothing else to come before us, we are adjourned at 9:09.
Good night,
No, no,
Commissioner
I'm
Dorian.
sorry, I snapped a little bit. It was just a lot of
Right.